Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of AIHR Live. My name is Nelly Valinden, and I am your host today. I hope everyone is doing well. Don't hesitate to say hi to us in the comments on LinkedIn and let us know where you are watching from, since we really appreciate it. With me today, as you can see, is Phil Strazzulla. Hi, Phil.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I'm very well. How are you over in Boston, I believe?
Yep, here in Boston. Pretty good. Having some unseasonably warm weather, which is always nice. The restaurants are staying open with outdoor dining, so I think a lot to be thankful for. Although it is very cold and rainy today, but
Okay.
the preceding week has been quite nice.
Oh Jesus, the idea alone of restaurants that are open actually is making me a little bit jealous, but let's not go into all that. I'll come back to you in a second, and then I'll give you a proper introduction. First of all, though, let me tell you, our audience, what we'll be doing today. So Phil and we will be talking about selecting HR software. We'll talk about what an HR tech selection process can look like, what stakeholders to involve, the kind of questions that you can ask vendors. And we'll be doing that for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have 15 minutes to answer as many of your questions as possible. So if during the episode at some point you have a question or a thought or feedback, please share it with us and we'll get to as many of them by the end of the episode. Okay, now, Phil, let me get you that proper introduction I promised. So Phil is, among many other things, a software entrepreneur and the founder of Select Software Review, a company that maps HR and recruitment software and then helps companies find the best vendors for them, but it also helps them with implementation best practices, the kind of questions to ask during demos, and how to think about ROI. And Phil is also one of our amazing instructors at the HR Academy. In other words, the best person to talk to when it comes to selecting HR software. Okay, Phil, I'm ready when you are. So if it's all good for you, then we can get started.
Yeah, let's do it. And I'm super excited to have people ask questions as well, because I think that's one of the great things about LinkedIn Live is it's an interactive conversation. So please fire away, everybody out there listening.
Yeah, I see that we do get some echo, some comments about the fact that we both have a slight echo. We are aware of that and we apologize, and we'll try to keep it in mind. And yeah, for me, I'll try to not talk too fast, and yeah, then I hope that will help. So the first question that I have for you, Phil, is HR departments, they don't just go out and start buying HR software, obviously. There are some steps that they need to go through before they get to that point. Can you perhaps guide us through the process before?
Yeah, sure. And I think it depends a little bit on what sort of organization you're in and what sort of role. There's folks that go into a new organization and they're sort of conducting an audit of the existing systems and how they're being used and how they're not being used, and perhaps where there are ways that you can decrease your budget. But I think the sort of more interesting frameworks are around people who are in an organization and they want to figure out, with all the hundreds literally of different categories of tools out there, where should I actually focus my time? And there's a few different ways that I think about this. The first is just sort of, where does your gut tell you to spend your time? Our brains work in very mysterious ways, and many times there's all sorts of calculus being run that we're not even aware of that makes us focus on certain things. It might be the candidate experience, and that could be the result of many different complaints from recruiters, from applicants, from hiring managers, etc. It could be perhaps connecting people who are working remotely. And again, that's just a function of the many different interactions that you're probably having with employees. So I think that's like probably one of the most powerful ways and probably the easiest way to figure out where to focus. The other sort of more rigorous analytical way, which I'm more accustomed to myself, is to think about your business and specifically connect with those functional leaders and product and sales, the executive team, the rest of the executive team, and really understand where are the bottlenecks for growth? What's sort of hampering your organization? And it could be that there's churn in your customer service ranks. It could be that you can't hire enough engineers to build the product you need. It could be, hey, we've got a really great product, but we need to scale our sales force, and specifically in different countries, et cetera. And so really digging into the problems of the other folks on the executive team is going to allow you to figure out where to spend your time. And obviously for each of those pains, there's a potential HR and people TA solution. And that's one of the magical things about the people function, is that you really touch all different parts of the business. And when you can align closely with one of those product leaders' goals, you can get budget faster, you can get implementation faster, you can partner with them to make anything that you do a huge success.
Yeah, so if I give a short recap of that, then it really is talk to other stakeholders in the business and look at the data, if you have data available, to see where to start, and perhaps what is the most pressing business need that you want to start improving. Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. And really think about it from the business perspective. You know, that's what all, like, your head of marketing, what are they doing? They're looking at the acquisition funnel and they're trying to understand where the bottlenecks are and how they can use marketing to address those to drive the business forward. HR should be doing the exact same thing, just usually in concert with another functional area, because people just touch every part of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once that phase is done, it is time, I imagine, to get a team together, because when it comes to selecting HR software, as you just said, Phil, people basically touches every aspect of the business. So an HR software project is likely to touch, obviously, a lot of people within the organization too. So what people or what stakeholders would you say should you get involved in this kind of project?
Yeah, so this is another sort of, like, it depends on how big your company is and all that stuff. Like, there are certain boxes you're almost certainly going to have to check when you go through any of these processes: budgeting, info security, IT implementation. And so that's sort of like your standard blocking and tackling. One of the tricks that I always recommend people implement is the cross-functional buying committee, which sort of sounds like this, like, business school jargon term, but essentially what it means is you have a project, and let's say it's to increase your employee engagement. There are people throughout your entire organization who really care about really any given initiative. Like, it's always shocking to me. And if you can pluck the leaders from each of these different functional areas who care about, in this case, employee engagement, and kind of corral them into a committee to help you brainstorm ideas, to help you do vendor selection, to help you get budget, internal stakeholder buy-in, manage people during implementation, et cetera, you're just going to be so much more powerful. And the way this works in practice is you literally just post on Slack or your social intranet or whatever the case may be, like, hey, we're on the people team, we're focused on increasing employee engagement this quarter or this year. If anybody's interested in being part of sort of an informal committee about this, that's going to meet, you know, once a month or once a quarter, let me know. And the people who opt into this stuff are always like the gunners. They're always the A players, because they're taking on extra work. You know, like, most people are not taking on extra work unless they are extremely ambitious and usually very capable. And so you get these, like, amazing people, you get 5 or 6 people together, and they help you do a better job at whatever project it is that you're pursuing.
Yeah, that was very useful, because I was actually going to ask you, okay, what does that mean in practice? How do you get these people together? But yeah, it can be as simple, obviously, as putting out a message via Slack or any other channel that you use within the organization, and just put the message out there and see whoever responds. So that was a great tip already, Phil. Thanks for that.
No worries.
All right, we are going to move on to the RFP, the request for proposal phase. Now, I know that this can be quite there's quite a lot of information that can be included in an RFP. And of course, as you already said before, I imagine it will definitely depend on the type of project, the type of company, and the type of software. However, can you give us a few elements that are important when it comes to an RFP?
Yeah, sure. So I think the basic elements are the must-haves and the nice-to-have in terms of features or integrations, etc. And I always recommend just sort of if you're using an RFP software, that's great. If not, like most people, just create a spreadsheet where the rows are the features and the columns are the vendors. A couple of like pro tips here. One thing that I think a lot of people don't think about too much is how much you like the vendors. So if you really like your salesperson, you think they're highly organized and they have a lot of insights and they kind of just like understand the space in your business, that probably means they're a really good salesperson. And good salespeople can choose where they want to work. They can literally choose any company. If you're over quota salesperson, like you just decide where you want to work. And where do you want to work for the most part? Companies that have really good products, because that allows you to crush your quota and make a lot of money. And so if you really like your salesperson, there's a really good chance that there's a good product behind that person. So that's like a one little sort of tip on diligence, and vice versa. If you have somebody who's just like a bad salesperson, like, look, you could get unlucky. Maybe you got sort of a bottom quartile person or somebody who's on their way out, et cetera. But it is a signal that I think people should pay attention to.
Yeah.
The other sort of tip that I've come across quite recently is if you create your little spreadsheet and after your first or second call, you send it to the vendor and you sort of black out the data that you've collected on other companies, but leave those companies' names in there, and just sort of send to the vendor and be like, hey, like, just want to make sure like this is what is actually accurate, like my notes are accurate. You will find that the vendors are much more willing to negotiate on price with you. And if you think about it, it's kind of like if you're buying a car and you, after visiting the Toyota dealership, basically send them a spreadsheet that's like, hey, I'm looking at all your competition. I'm looking at Ford and Mercedes and all these other things. They're going to know that you're a savvy consumer and they're going to try to give you the best price. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that shows that that is a highly effective strategy for negotiating price, especially with enterprise software.
Okay, well, I think to me that sounds as a really good tip. Both of them, actually. I really thought the one about the salesperson was super interesting, and I think you have a really good point there. Indeed, if you are a great salesperson, you can probably choose where you want to work. So that was a good one. But the second one definitely was very interesting as well. So thank you for that.
Of course.
I am turning back to our lovely audience once again. I have, let me see, 2 more questions for Phil myself, and then we will be able to answer your questions. So if you have any question, thought, or whatsoever, please share it with us in the comments and we will get to them very soon. Okay, then, yes. So we are getting to the vendor selection, Phil. So when we talk about vendor selection, what is important? Once again, perhaps you can, share some tips like you just did.
Yeah, so it's one of these things that I think it's a skill that you develop over the course of reps, doing it many times over the course of years. And again, it's very different for different types of tools, whether you're doing, a self-service free tool you can try, or you're doing one of these like huge enterprise level RFPs. I think some of the keys are staying organized and understanding what is your criteria up front, how you're thinking about value. So I always think about, how is this going to impact the business in a way that the CFO is going to appreciate, and build an actual financial model around that. And so maybe for employee engagement, it's like, hey, we've got a 30% churn within customer success, and we think by increasing employee engagement, it'll go down to 26%, and that incremental 4% is going to lead to XYZ savings. And then the cool part about that, in my opinion, is it's sort of like a journal entry that you can go back to 18 months from now and be like, oh, was it 4%? Was it 3%? Were we right? Were we wrong, et cetera? So I think picking a vendor that aligns with the goals that you set out, because a lot of these categories of software are highly nebulous, especially the emerging ones. Like if you look at like AI HR software, there's like stuff that will convert people on your career site. There's stuff that allows you to source better, to schedule better, to do onboarding better, to answer internal employee questions better. And so just going to like an AI vendor, you really need to understand how they align with your vision. The other sort of very tactical pro tip that I'll say here, because I think everybody's very stressed for time, is that when you do create your shortlist and you request vendor demos, I highly recommend that the first email that comes back to you, you make it extremely clear that you have BANT, which stands for budget, authority, need, and timeline. Vendors only want to spend time with you if they think you're worth their time. And so they have these like junior salespeople that are just like trying to figure out, like, are you the right person? Do you actually have the money? Are you going to do it soon? And so in order to like skip a lot of that stuff, you can coordinate over email, save yourself some time. So I think like this is sort of like a bit of a rambling answer, because there are so many like little tiny things that you can learn about. And that's frankly like what we write about on our website all the time, in our newsletter, et cetera. And so I think there's like millions of little tips, and it just like, it's so different depending on what type of software you're actually looking for.
Of course, yeah, and it's always difficult to put all of that in a 20-minute conversation that we are having right now. But I think what stood out to me is the band, what you were mentioning. So a budget, authority, need, and timeline, I think. I think that's an interesting one, and I can see how it makes sense to make it very clear to vendors that you have all of those. Something else I was wondering about when it comes to vendor selection, among, of course, many other tips that you can probably share, but is it wise as well to ask them already about the implementation phase and how that will be going? Is this something that you should ask about during the vendor selection already?
Yeah, without a doubt, because if you think about it, that's a huge cost. It's not an explicit cost with money, but it's a massive cost in terms of your team and potentially even like your internal social capital. If something is really arduous on behalf of the rest of the organization or your team, then that's going to cost you something, especially if it doesn't work out. So I think it's really important to get the specifics around implementation. A lot of vendors, a lot of salespeople, quite frankly, if you ask about implementation, they'll tell you about the best ever implementation. Yeah. And that's certainly useful. But you want to understand for your company, realistically, with the way that you guys move and approve things and get stuff done, like what's actually going to happen and what are the steps going to be. And if somebody can't articulate that, then you need to talk to the account manager, and you need to really drill into what people are saying and not just take it at face value, because it's really easy to say like, oh yeah, we hook up your ATS and then we get it live on, whatever your job pages. Those two steps could take literally 18 months. If you're talking about maybe using like an enterprise recruitment marketing software. So you need to understand at a very granular level, like what actually happens, who does the work, and what's the timeline.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, and that means I have one more question left for you from me, Phil, before we head over to the audience questions. And this is one looking perhaps a little bit to the future. It's almost 2021. So what HR technology or categories are you currently most excited about yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's an emerging field around people analytics that is very accessible to more and more companies. So a lot of people analytics right now is happening in like Tableau or Power BI, where you have individual people that have technical skills who can pull in data from all different places in your organization and run analyses and generate insights. But I think there are companies like Lattice or Pecan or 7Geese or whatever who are sort of like taking that stuff and putting into pre-made dashboards that can actually drive a lot of insight for your company. And you're seeing this across lots of different types of vendors. So that's a really interesting place, in my opinion. And then I think probably the other big one is just everything that's happening with automation. Software allows humans to be more efficient, and software that's like slightly more intelligent allows humans to be like even more efficient. And I always think about AI like this exoskeleton that's going to allow a recruiter to, recruit twice as many people a month because they don't have to continuously like follow up with candidates, and they don't have to run very manual queries on databases, et cetera. A lot of this stuff is now being done by machines who are actually getting pretty good at it. And I think that's going to be a huge thing for both the enterprise and also smaller people teams.
Cool. Thank you for that. All right, let me take a look at the audience questions that are coming in. I have a first one here, and that is, what common software selection challenges can HR professionals prepare for, and how can they do that? So perhaps you can name two.
Sure. I think probably the two biggest are, one, getting internal buy-in. A lot of times HR is this like super under-resourced team, which is insane because you're asked to do so much. And so making sure that there's somebody who's really good at controlling the purse strings that is bought into what you're doing. And that gets back to this whole like alignment with maybe the head of sales to be like, hey, we're going to get you more salespeople. We need a better sourcing platform. Or head of customer success, hey, we need less churn in our ranks. We need better employee engagement. So I think that's a big thing. I think the next is just whittling down these massive vendor ecosystems into manageable shortlists of actually good vendors, which is what we do all day long. That's like our whole website is like these shortlists. But if you look at like ATS, there's probably like 300 or 400 ATSs, many of which are not very good solutions. And so you've got to find ways to get the signal on websites like ours to get the shortlist to actually be efficient. Otherwise, you're going to spend years on demos.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like you said, I mean, just for one type of HR software, there can be hundreds of vendors. So I think it is definitely wise to get help to see more clearly and to avoid getting lost. A next question that I have, and it is a question coming from Dhanashri Corey. I hope I pronounced your name all right. And the question is creating an in-house HRIS better than purchasing one from a vendor, as the cost involved should be justified?
I think if you have like an amazingly unique, complex company where people are your number one thing, then it might make sense to create your own HRIS. Like, let's say you're Goldman Sachs, they might have the resources and the need to do something like that. But if you think about like the economics of software, like the reason that it makes so much sense as a business is let's take like video interviews, for example, like this company, My Interview in Israel, right? Like they've created a platform that then people can use for a very cheap amount of dollars per month versus creating their own video interview platform, which would cost them hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do, right? And so it almost never makes sense unless you truly have an amazingly complex, idiosyncratic, large organization like maybe McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. But otherwise, I don't think it makes sense.
Thank you. All right, I have another question here. And the question is, how do we determine existing talents' capabilities, such as technical abilities in using analytical software, that can adapt to new changes before implementing or selecting a vendor?
Yeah, so there are many interesting assessment vendors out there now. There's obviously like, behavioral and lots of different skills-based ones. And there's a whole swath of really amazing, specifically technical assessment tools that can understand like somebody's facility with something like Python or very specific problem set, but also can figure out how do they work within teams? How do they work within existing code bases? All these other skills that make somebody a successful programmer or not. The big caveat here is that you can really only use these platforms with more junior talent. Once you get into the senior ranks, principal engineers, people get really turned off if you say, hey, go take this test. And it's like, well, I've worked at Google for the last 10 years. Like, you're going to have me take some random test and I have to study for it. And you know what I mean? Like, it's just like a really bad candidate experience. And so that's sort of, one of the biggest caveats with all this automation stuff is that you can't take the human out of human resources, I guess. And you have to be very cognizant about how this is impacting both sides, your recruiters as well as the candidates.
Do you think we'll get there though, Phil, at some point? Do you think we'll get to a point where, even people who have a lot of experience, when they, get considered for a role, that they'll find that acceptable and that the technology will get there as well in terms of assessments?
That's a really good question. I'm actually pretty skeptical. Like the technology would have to be as good as a human. And like, I think we're probably decades away from that. The technology right now is like good to understand these like very basic skills, but anything more complicated than that and like making people feel special and like all these other things that go into a really awesome recruiting process, which is what you need to land these like top data scientists, we're light years away from that being a reality, I think.
Yeah, we're interested to see. Who knows?
Yeah.
Let me see. Yes, I have another question here, and it's coming from Abdul. It is, could you suggest an HRIS with the best performance management system?
Oh, wow.
Or perhaps you can name a few if you,
yeah,
to not play any favors.
Right, exactly. This is where I get in trouble. So I think that if you're looking for like if you're looking for a rock solid performance management system, you're probably going to have to buy a point solution. You're going to have to, go and invest in Elumi or Lattice or whatever, because they've just built so much more. Like if you look at your typical HRIS, like Bamboo, like they have performance management, but it's a C- relative to some of these point solutions. One of the really good HRISs that I've come across recently is called Bob. It's based out of Israel. They just started getting into the United States market. I'm not sure where you are, Abdul, but like they probably have an offering in your market. And like they do have some interesting performance management stuff in there because it's such a newer solution. But I would say that if that's your core focus, you're probably going to have to get a point solution in addition to your HRIS and just make sure that they talk to each other. Okay.
Thank you, Bob. I like the name. Okay, I think the last question for now, and that is, do you have perhaps any tips for choosing the members for the, I don't know what you called it before, I think the software buying committee, in the event that you have too many people that, want to get involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, and what a great problem to have. I guess you come from an organization where people are very engaged. If you anticipate that, I would maybe put up some sort of like gate to get people who are actually interested and actually going to do the work. So maybe it's like, hey, can you fill out this form to give me your 3 best ideas to tackle this solution? Or something that's a bit of a hurdle. Or honestly, like if you could very politely say, hey, Jim in marketing, like we already have Mary in marketing who's going to help out with us. So like, thank you so much. We're actually tackling like XYZ other people problem next quarter. Do you want to be part of that sort of thing? Because you really don't want more than maybe 6 people, and ideally all cross-functional, to be on one of these things. Otherwise, it just gets too unwieldy.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I see one more, and we still have a little bit of time, so I'll hop it in there. So what would you say is the most common pitfall that companies get trapped in the RFP process?
So there's lots of idiosyncratic pitfalls to different softwares, and we try to like list a bunch of those on the website, because you can do stuff to screw up an ATS that's different from employee engagement or AI.
Yeah.
I think that honestly, probably the biggest thing that HR teams in general run into is that they get too bogged down and too risk averse, and they don't end up pulling the trigger on stuff fast enough. I think that a lot of times it's just sort of how HR can be programmed, because of all the stuff we have to do that is risk mitigation, that we're very afraid to switch systems, to try systems. And this is why, honestly, like in sales and marketing and engineering, you see a lot of enterprise software that you can just try. It's this whole like product-led growth sort of thing that's taking over SaaS. You don't see that too much in HR. And I think it's because the vendors don't build that stuff, because a lot of HR people don't just say, yeah, you know what, let me just try this thing. And some of it's hard to try, right? Like a new ATS or something like that. But I think that's probably the biggest knock on HR in general with buying software. And in order to get over it, you just have to be robust about how you're thinking about the business case, the questions you're asking vendors, and the process that you run. And if you do a good job, you should feel really confident in the tool that you're selecting. And you're going to get it wrong sometimes, like it's just the fact of life, but you're going to get better and better at it over time. And you're going to get less wrong and less wrong, and probably achieve some pretty absurd results, especially if you're adopting these newer solutions that can truly transform your business.
So the questions, they just still keep coming, which is fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So I'll shoot another one to you, Phil. The one is coming from Keith Mitchell, and he says, can you please address some security aspects of selecting a product, particularly when purchasing a product from offshore? Security by design is important for HR products. Now, this is a little bit about security, so yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that at the end of the day, security is so specialized and it's changing so quickly that it's almost impossible to be an expert with the security implications of a given software. I think that people should be aware of things like GDPR and CCPA, and where personally identified information is being collected, how it's being stored. Does your organization require a vendor to have a SOC 2 audit, to be ISO compliant, et cetera? And you can basically get a checklist from your InfoSec team, your IT team, maybe your CFO's office, depending on your organization, to ask vendors on calls, because you don't want to get down the line with somebody and you need a SOC audit and they don't have it. And it's like, oh, okay, I wish I knew that before I spent 4 meetings with you. But in order for you to truly understand like the ins and outs of how data is being moved and like, is it being hashed before it's being passed through an API and like all this stuff that probably sounds like mumbo jumbo, it's just impossible. And so you have to rely on your functional area experts within the organization when it comes to that. Get somebody from IT to give you a question list at the beginning and then to join a call later on with the vendor or send over a questionnaire later in the process.
Yeah, seems to make complete sense. All right, now I think this is definitely the last question, and it's coming from Maguina Elias. Oh, sorry, Jack Maguina Elias. I'm sorry, Jack. And the question is, how many years do you need to predict early turnover? Now, I guess that will definitely depend as well. And I'm not sure if you can answer the question, Phil, but maybe you can.
How many years do you need to predict early turnover? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm perhaps Jack, if you could perhaps specify a little bit, and otherwise
maybe data.
Maybe I was thinking too. Maybe in terms of data, yes.
Yeah, I'm not very good at statistics, but
neither am I, by the way.
Yeah, it's very unintuitive. I would imagine it's many years across many different people because you're going to have so much variability where like your standard deviation is going to be quite large. And so in order to really predict it, like, you know, it depends on how large the organization is. I would say for 100 people, it's probably, you know, 4 or 5 years. And for 1,000 people, it's probably slightly less than that. And vice versa for smaller organizations. But that's a great question for Excel. So don't hold me to that.
Yes. Okay, well, that wraps up our session, Phil. So I want to thank you very much again for being here with us today. I hope you enjoyed our conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody who asked these amazing questions.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I'm gonna say goodbye to you for now, Phil.
Sounds good. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.
Yes, you too. Goodbye.
Bye.
Now, from me to you, I want to thank you as well for joining us again for today's episode of AIHR Live. About the digitalization of HR, this is going very fast, and that makes knowing how to select and implement HR software is becoming more and more important as well. So at the Academy to Innovate HR, we've created a brand new course on how to implement HR software. So if you are interested to learn more about implementing HR software or how to lead the digital transformation of HR, you can take a look at our digital HR certificate program, and the enrollment for that program closes tonight. You can find more information about that on our website, AIHR.com. And then, yeah, I hope to see you next time for a new episode of AIHR Live. Thank you very much again for watching, and stay safe. Goodbye.